So hi everybody, I'm really thrilled to be chatting to the brilliant impressionist and comedian Rory Bremner. Rory, thank you so much for sparing the time to
It's a
speak to
pleasure.
me today. I know you're so
Absolutely, it's a
busy.
pleasure. It's a pleasure. Oh, we're getting our pings and Zoom, all those extraneous noises that you
How
get.
do I stop
But
those, I wonder?
I never know actually. No, no, don't worry. It
Oh
keeps
well,
it makes
there's nothing
they
you
they
can do.
know this is we're not faking this. It's
Yes,
this
exactly,
is
it's
not
the
deep. This
real
is not
thing.
deep fakery. This is with all of the bells and whistles of everyday life. We're all used to those.
Yes,
But yeah,
exactly.
lovely to be here. Thank you.
No, well, thank you. So did you initially start as a comedian or an impersonator?
No, I finished as a comedian. That was, no, I kind of think it does go back to school, unfortunately, and I think it was, just that thing of just enjoying doing voices and enjoying sort of being a little bit of a class clown. So I'd always had an interest in comedy. I lived in Edinburgh; that was my hometown,
Yeah.
and of course, every year the circus comes to town, the end of August, beginning of September, and it's just so. I mean, when I was sort of growing up, if you think about that time between sort of 78, 79, 82, when I was around about 18, 19, you'd have had people like Stephen Fry, Emma Thompson, Hugh Laurie, Rick Mail, Ade Edmondson, Victoria Wood, all these people sort of beginning, and Rowan Atkinson, of course. Certainly those footlights, Stephen Fry and Emma Thompson, and also Rowan from Oxford. Certainly those they all had shows in Edinburgh, so you go and see them. And so I had, on the one hand, I had these voices, which I did, and I started off doing sports commentators, like Bill McLaren. And of course, if you like your rugby, Panda, you'll remember that in those days you had people who were the voice of their sport. You had the voice of rugby was Bill McLaren. Peter
Yeah.
O'Sullivan was the voice of horse racing, of course. You
Brilliant.
had Brian Johnson was the voice of cricket, of course, or maybe
Yeah.
John Arlott. You'd have John Motson, who'd be the voice of football, very much so, I have to say. And Peter Alice, well, there we go. You'd be the voice of golf. And so there was so much
Brilliant.
to choose from. So I had voices, and I loved sort of making people laugh, but I also had a love of those kind of late night satire shows, which were they were kind of quite edgy, they were different, they were slightly alternative. And then I had the sort of amazing coincidence of time, because the London cabaret circuit really kicked off in this sort of 82, 83, around about that sort of time. That's when the Comic Strip Club was going. That's when French and Saunders and Alexi Sale and people were working away. And I remember going to the Comic Strip, rather, around about sort of 82, when I was at university in London. So combination of
Yes.
Edinburgh childhood, London university, everything was kicking off in 82, and here was somebody with their voices who loved doing comedy. So yeah, that's how it started.
And what was your big break, would you say?
Well, a couple of those. I mean, at a small scale, that cabaret circuit in London was great fun, and you'd sort of get bookings. And I think my first was with the Finborough Arms, I think, in Earl's Court,
Mm.
because in those days, the pubs which had theatres sometimes above, and then there was a change in the licensing laws, and so they became sort of stand-up venues, and you'd end up doing sort of 3 shows in an evening. You could start off at the Finborough Arms in Earl's Court, then zoom on
Yeah.
the Piccadilly line up to Hemmingford Arms in Islington, and then zoom back down again to finish the evening at Jongleurs, which was in Battersea. And often you'd have there was a great double act called Calypso Beat, and that was Ainsley Harriott and his great friend, and they were great show closers, because they would just get the audience going
Yeah.
around the tables and singing calypso and stuff. And you'd have people like Jeremy Hardy and Mark Steele and Harry Enfield and Julian Clary, who in those
Yes.
days had an act called the Joan Collins Fan Club. I don't know if you remember that, Panda, if you're old enough. And I interviewed him the other day, and he's not lost it. Let's put it this way. So funny, because we were doing the Borders Book Festival, and I said, "Are you enjoying it?" He said, "Oh no, everything." By the way, with Julian, as soon as you interview Julian, everything becomes a double entendre. So
Really?
I would say, "Oh, it's fantastic. Thank you so much for coming all the way up." And he'd say, "Well, let's take things one thing at a time, shall we?" That I had a rather interesting drive here. Said the man who was driving me was very keen to tell me about the local area. He said, "We've got 3 supermarkets. was very thrilled to hear that. He said, and we've got 2 butchers. I thought, that's wonderful. I said, are there any male prostitutes? So Julian was there, and so yes, we had that cabaret circuit. So my first break was doing that was that, but it was really at that time TV producers were sort of on the out on the hunt for just acts all the time, and Russell Harty was doing a show at Terry Wogan, but it was Terry Wogan who was really very influential, because not only did he pick me up on his radio show from the Edinburgh Festival, we did a show called Cut Off at the Fringe, I think, Cut Off at the Fringe, and that I was hosting that, and it was the best of the acts from Edinburgh. And Terry Wogan picked it up. He said, here's a young man who's doing voices nobody else does. And so he used it on his show and on the radio. And we fast forward to 1985, and when he went to 3 shows a week on the BBC, and I did the first of those shows with
wow.
I remember being terrified because the other guests were sort of Elton John and Tina Turner, and he was this impressionist who nobody ever heard of. And I had about sort of, I don't know, 8 or 9 minutes, a huge amount of time on that show. Then the phone started ringing the next day. So very grateful to Terry Wogan for that. That's when it really sort of exploded. And then after that, it was David Frost, who was also had a very influential in my career. He got me to do his Sunday morning shows, as you remember, with the Breakfast with Frost. And I did that for sort of years from 92 onwards. So those 2 really were hugely influential in my career. Along with John Bird and John Fortune. Yeah. Oh, well, Terry was great, and he did those shows. And also John Bird and John Fortune, who I worked with from about 1989 onwards, because I started with the BBC for a few years and then went to Channel 4. And John Bird and John Fortune went with me from BBC to Channel 4, and they were huge influences, just wonderful, lovely, lovely guys. And their intelligence, and they taught me so much about satire, and they taught me so much about, and just there was an effortlessness. And in any walk of life, I think what you love is effortlessness, which is it's that mixture of skill, but it's just that's sort of hidden. It's almost taken for granted. It's because when it's effortless, it's people who have a tremendous skill and who are in the zone, who are enjoying themselves, who are relaxed. Think of David Gower batting. He had that skill, obviously, but there was a freedom about it. And when the Johns, when John Bird and Fortune, when they were in their absolute prime, they they would occasionally just make each other laugh with just the joy of it. And I think that's something you forget. There's just such a joy of and then those days they would sometimes just read out government policy straight, and people would be sort of clutching their sides with laughter at the ridiculousness of it. And I'm so sad that they haven't been around to see the last 10 years. John Fortune died about 7 or 8 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, and that they weren't sort of around to take us through the coalition and through the Brexit years up to this period of incredible maturity and stability that we're all enjoying, because I can't remember a more stable and quiet time in politics, because it obviously has gone crazy.
Yeah, completely has. Well, sort of moving on to staying with the sort of politics, whether you sort of agree or disagree with their politics, people like Trump, Boris, must be absolute gifts to you from the impersonation point.
Where are the gifts? Where are the gifts to keep on giving, Panda? Because people were big characters, big characters. Well, I don't know who's bigger, myself or Donald. We can maybe have a discussion about that. But I think satire needs grotesques. It needs the big characters. I suppose when I started out, of course, it was Thatcher and it was Ronald Reagan. And then we had that period of calm, I suppose, with John Major. But, there were always things happening over Maastricht. And, I had trouble with my backbenchers. I don't know if you can imagine a time when the Eurosceptics and the Brexiteers made life hard for a British Prime Minister. It's rather hard to remember. But yes, we had those. It's very ambiguous, because obviously Trump's politics and Boris Johnson's politics are not my politics at all. But yet, of course, as characters, you are very reliant, and you want people who with big voices. I mean, William Hague was obviously, when he was the foreign secretary, when David Cameron was the prime minister, a prime minister who thought that Somalia was a wine waiter. He was a big, he was a voice that people recognized, and people, you need to have that.
Yeah.
And so that's really something that, and you got the George Bushes or Bill Clintons or these characters. Whereas now, I mean, I don't know how much mileage there's in doing sort of, I don't know, Ben Wallace. I'm loath to mention cabinet ministers because you don't know if they'll be there tomorrow.
Well, they probably won't be there tomorrow.
Exactly.
But
so the Ben Wallace's, or even Jeremy Hunt. I mean, I don't know. If I did a perfect Jeremy Hunt now, I don't think people wouldn't necessarily recognize it. So yeah, that's it. You want characters, and also with an impression, you start off quite close because you're working with a voice first of all, and you've got to capture that voice and the intonation. And I suppose if it was John Major, the interesting thing was because John Major, it started off a bit like a train spotter voice. When someone say, "Oh yes, I know the times of trains. Yes, that one leaves at 11:17. Oh yes, I've got a whole dictionary of and that was when the old locomotives used to run." And people used to talk like that if they were train spotted. That was the kind of train spotty voice. But then you had to soften it, which was a little bit of Julian Clary, which I've mentioned already. And if you soften the train spotter voice, you end up with that. Yes. And that is not, if I may say so, Panda, that's not a million miles away from John Major. It's funny. It's a little bit like, you're making a paint, what is it? Green and was it yellow and blue make green or whatever.
Yes.
You take a little bit of Julian Clary, a little bit of train spotter. If you want to do Ed Miliband, for example, I mean, Ed Miliband is, you take Tony Blair, and obviously, Tony Blair has got that kind of, that sort of very quite sibilant, sort of quite open voice and that kind of interesting. And if you take Chris Tarrant, who he speaks from the back of his throat, and it's kind of like, okay, it's going to be A, it's going to be B, and if you put those two together, you get Ed Miliband, and it's extraordinary. And you have to get the letter L, which is, as a Labour leader, I want to give leadership to this country. And I give you my pledges. These are my pledges. I'm never going to give you up. I'm never going to let you down. So it's funny how you put voices together, and it's just mixtures of the two, really. So that's the fun of doing voices. But as I say, you need to have recognizable voices to begin with, because Phil Hammond or Jeremy Hunt or even Keir Starmer. I mean, people are starting to get Keir Starmer because again, he's a little bit back of the throat. He's a bit Josh Whittaker-y, isn't he?
Yeah, he is.
I would say I'm slightly stuck in Miliband mode there, actually. I think I'd say to the Prime Minister, what is he doing? There's a friend of mine, Matt Ford, who does impressions, and he says if you want to be Keir Starmer, you just have to say the phrase "the Metropolitan Police." Yes, you just have to say the words "the Metropolitan Police," and that somehow gets you there. But anyway,
but women, sort of, so female prime ministers must be much trickier if you've got a woman like Thatcher, Theresa May. Does that make it harder?
You say that. But of course, the greatest Margaret Thatcher impressionist was Steve Nallen, who did an amazing job. So he kind of specialised in that. He did Margaret Thatcher for Spitting Image, Steve Nallen, and he could also do brilliant Alan Bennett, and he did Roy Hattersley, of course. You remember Roy Hattersley with that puppet? He used to sort of spit and dribble everywhere, and. So but you see now there always were then. I mean, in the days when Mike Yarwood was going, he got Faith Brown and Janet Brown, I think, as well, to do Margaret Thatcher. And, there are brilliant female impressionists now. I work with Jan Ravens, Jan Ravens is fantastic. And she did the most brilliant Theresa May, and also did a brilliant Liz Truss. I mean, here's the thing, of course, she just got Liz Truss. And I was always thinking, God, in 2 weeks, you've lost a queen and gained a prime minister, and I'd lost a prime minister and gained a king. So we were kind of swapping roles. But her Liz Truss kind of lasts about, what was it, 6-7 weeks, 44 days or something in office. But anyway, there are some. So there's Jan, there's Deborah Stevenson, there's Jess Robinson, there's 2 or 3 others that I work with as well. They're really brilliant. And I kind of think, well, why would I do women
No,
voices
exactly.
when they're so good at it.
Yeah, no, quite right, quite right. And so in the past, you've done impersonations of people like Nelson Mandela, and I think
Yeah.
your TV show you used to put sort of makeup on to look like Mandela. Is that something that you couldn't do today because of the blackface controversy?
Yeah, well, I think so, because you have to recognize, sensitivities, and I think that at the time, it was, I didn't think twice about it, because the point was, with it, whichever character I was doing, we would put makeup on for the character. So if I was being Robin Cook, it'd be sort of the beard, and this is Bill Clinton would be a grey wig for him. And so for Mandela, or for Trevor McDonald, or for Ainsley Harriott, or whatever, you just looked like the character, and it didn't cross my mind, because it was never about the color of their skin. It was just about their character. But of course, more recently, it's become more of a sort of thing about blackface, and that's why I wouldn't do that now, because if you were to do it now, you'd look like you're being deliberately provocative, and it would be misinterpreted. And I think you have to recognize, people get terribly worked up about political correctness or woke or whatever, but both of those are grounded rather in a sense of showing empathy and showing understanding. And I think if people are sensitive, and about, in that case, blackface, I mean, I don't want to continue being deliberately provocative or insensitive. Why would I want to do that? And there's an element, I say, about the PC, or the kind of people, this church for woke agenda, and it's just about trying to see the world the way that other people see it. I mean, I've spoken since to people that I used to make up for, some of the blackface makeup characters, and I've kind of made my peace with them, so to apologize. I said, look, I'd be mortified if I thought for a second that you thought that the idea was, oh yeah, great, we're gonna, and they said, no, didn't think that for a moment. But I felt I needed to just be clear that there was never any intent there at all. It was about an integrity of purpose, really. I thought, right, okay, we're going to do this character, and I need to look. I mean, Bruce Forsyth, I mean, he could sort of say, I mean, the size of his chin, Panda. I mean, it would barely stay on. If I was doing a sketch, if I was in makeup as Bruce Forsyth, if it took more than half an hour to film the sketch, the chin would literally be started, because the glue would just be really straight. So that was it. It was just, we used to love to try and get the makeup as accurate as possible, and not for a moment was it ever about making fun of people's color.
I mean, do you think, though, that sort of, I know it's harder today being a comedian, and you've got to be careful about what you say. Do you think that with comedy you should be able to push the boundaries at times and be a little bit controversial?
Well, of course you should, but the difficulty is that it's context, isn't it? And it is that you're aware all the time when you're doing material which works at an occasion in a particular context, and it works really, really well. But all you need is somebody at the back, sort of telephoning the mail or whatever, and sort of say, "Oh yes, or we did a joke about this or about that," and you think that's just so completely taking it out of context. You weren't there. Give you an example. When Jimmy Carr was doing a show, I think he was at Headley Court, where some of the soldiers who've come back from Afghanistan and Iraq and stuff, they were being treated with horrendous injuries. They had prosthetic limbs and being taught to walk again and stuff, and amazing work they were doing there. And, these amazingly brave soldiers. And Jimmy was with them for a day, and he was talking at the end. He said, well, I've met some extraordinary people, and seen some horrendous injuries. He said, but bloody hell, we're going to have a fantastic Paralympic team. And they laughed, because it was all about what was possible, and it was that kind of black army humor. But I think he told that joke outside the context, and straight away it was a Jimmy and sick joke about our armed forces. And that's a classic case of something that is born of a particular context. And
And it's so
you know, it's
naughty the way the papers,
well,
they
yeah,
twist
well,
everything.
I mean, it's done deliberately, and
Yeah, yeah.
you know, I think about the time of the Queen's funeral or something, and there was, I think that week somebody was having a birthday party, and London was just full of crowds of people. And so I think I said, I was doing that show, and I said, you know, I had no idea how popular this man was, because you can't move for the crowds outside and everything.
Mm.
And that was about him. It was a joke in the context, but all you
Yes.
needed was somebody like, oh, making jokes about
Yeah,
the
yeah,
royal funeral. And it was a million miles away from that. It was just
yeah.
say, so comedy has a context, and I think you've got to be really careful. But, um, you know, so what do you do when you think that something could be deliberately misconstrued?
Mm.
um I think you just got to have confidence in your material, and I
Yes.
suppose, you
Yeah.
know, there is an element in which you sort of slightly, if it's a radio show or whatever, you might just think, well, not only am I happy with this joke,
Mm.
because, you know, you obviously, if you need to do material that you're happy with,
Mm.
but am I able to defend this if there's a pushback against this?
Yes. Yeah.
Am I able to defend this on its own terms?
Yeah.
And you know, you do have to think about that, because, you know, the flip side of that is when people say, "Good, you know, I mean, I have to be very, very careful. I have to be very careful what I say." And somebody will say, "Well, sorry, what was it? What was it that you actually wanted to say?" And,
Yes.
you know, so often you can find what they wanted to say was actually quite offensive. And you
Yes.
just think,
Yes.
well, just, and somebody said the other day, "So, I mean, I have to think what I say now." And I sometimes you say, well, is it such a bad thing that, you know, you're just thinking a little bit
Yeah.
about,
Before you. Yeah.
is something appropriate, is something inoffensive, is something insulting, or whatever. But, you know, that's part of the kindness. I mean, goodness, there's so much anger and so much, I mean, of course, it's monetized by social media, because, you know,
Yes.
you look how Brazil, just in the last sort of week, how polarized Brazil was. It was like, you know, 50.5 against 49.5. America is really divided. The Brexit thing, there's real, you know, division, and social media kind of monetizes that. And I really want to try to take the heat out of it,
Yes.
in a sense, because you know, when it gets into the culture wars, or the trans wars, and the sort of the J.K. Rowling thing and all the rest of it, I find the whole, it's so heated, it's so,
Mm.
um uh, I suppose, as you say, divisive, unpleasant,
Yes.
angry.
Yeah.
And I suppose it was, you know, the beaching cuts you had on the railways, where, you know, you had these railway lines were cut. I kind of think emotionally we've had sort of beaching cuts, because, you know, there used to be a few stops between calm and angry. You know, you could be frustrated, you could be disappointed, you could be
Yeah.
dismayed, you could be upset, or whatever. But now this kind of tendency to go straight to, I'm really angry
Yeah.
about this. And there is a lot of anger. So
Mm.
sometimes, in terms of, you know, the comedy or whatever, it's a question of, you know, it should bring people together, I
Yeah.
suppose. And
Absolutely.
that's what you really want to do. But I mean, also, from satirical point of view, you want to try to, I suppose I always think about, you got to make sense of stuff and then make nonsense of it. So I
Mm.
have to kind of understand what's going on politically, and
Yeah.
then interpret it in a way that makes people laugh. And I suppose, you know, sometimes you can do that in a line with David Cameron, saying,
Yeah.
what I would say, you know, if I think, you know, when I became prime minister, I mean, back in 2010, and people said, look, are you going to make the rich richer, or are you going to make the poor poorer? And I think we've managed to do both. And I think that's absolutely great. So you got the voice there. You know, I hope, you know, you got the David Cameron voice, but
Brilliant.
but the point that you're making, is that, yes, this was a kind of decade in which the rich got richer and the poor got poorer.
Yes.
I mean, I know you can argue about Gini coefficients and all that sort of stuff,
Mm.
but that is the fundamental,
Yeah.
point. And so you're making people laugh with the voice, you're making people laugh with the characterization, but also there's a point underneath. And each joke, as somebody says, you know, it's a revolution or an explosion, and it should be that release of saying, yes, that's it. That is what
Yes.
is so annoying. So you want to get to the heart of stuff, and that's, I think, what you want to do as a satirist. You want to have people laughing at, um, or at a perception of the truth. You want to have,
Yes.
it's about
Yes.
ridicule. It's about, um, I suppose, lampooning something which is
Mm.
just indefensible, and that's part of the problem now, is that we've seen in the last few weeks, I mean, policies and characters and premierships, whole premierships
Yeah.
that are so self-evidently ridiculous in their own right. That I sometimes say, it's part of my job to make politicians more ridiculous than they already are. Have you any idea how hard that is
Mm.
right now? And if a Martian said, "Take me to your leader," you'd be embarrassed, wouldn't you?
Yeah,
You
you
could sort of
would.
think, well,
You
let's
would.
just go and have a cup of coffee
Yeah.
instead. So yeah, that's where we are with Trump and people like that. But there's also it's a very sinister undercurrent, because you have to see that where Trump starts, where Trump starts in that sort of ridiculous, kind of overblown narcissistic thing, but it ends on the steps of the Capitol with
Yeah.
people, and it ends, with people trying to kidnap Nancy Pelosi. So where it's really, really, fervent and hot now. And I suppose I think it was Lenin who saw it. Might have been Richard Madeley. No, I think it was Lenin, who said there are decades where nothing happens for weeks, and then there are weeks where decades happen, and we're living through the weeks where decades are happening.
We really are, aren't we?
And people say, "Oh gosh, you must have so much material," and I go, "Yeah, well, I did last week,
It's changing
but now I've got to,
constantly.
we've got to
Yeah.
start again." I mean, all this
Yeah.
Boris stuff. How long? How long? I mean, there was a moment when I thought, well, Boris is coming back,
Yeah.
and we're going to have another, a couple of years of productive chaos, and we're going to party like it's 2020. And that's why, sorry, I've forgotten. Of course, the best parties are the ones you've forgotten, and I've forgotten most of those.
Yeah.
And all of that was returning. But
Mm.
on the one hand, you're thinking, well, from a comedy point of view, Boris was kind of useful, but on the other hand, even the comedians, let me tell you, are just thinking, can we just have a little bit of boring? Can we just have a
Yeah.
little bit of stability? And
Yes.
I know history moves fast, but you think, I just wish it would, slow the hell down
I
for a
know
while,
it needs to, doesn't
so
it?
we can catch our breath.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Rory, what's the process you sort of go through? Do you have a sort of certain, I don't know, well, yeah, process where somebody new comes on the scene and you're looking to do their impression? Is it listening to their voice all the time, watching their
Yeah.
mannerisms? I don't know, do you
Funny.
run it past Tessa or someone else?
Uh,
Or do you practice?
well, no, funnily enough, I'm kind of less motivated, less driven by voices than I was, perhaps for the reasons I said earlier, that I don't kind of find the characters as, well, I would say, as remarkable or
Mm,
easy as in many ways. I don't find them, I mean, I don't really think, God, do I want to spend a lot of time, learning how to do an impression of Ryland Clark? Or I'd say that doesn't sort of motivate me quite as much. It's more about the material. It's, as I said, about trying to make sense of what's going on. And I
yes.
do a lot of corporate shows, a lot of private shows now, and there it's about, what is that audience? What if it's a corporate show? What do they do? What are these people thinking? What is their so what's their experience day to day, and how can I make that up? Or if it's a private thing, for um, you know 50th birthday parties or whatever, and you sort of think, okay, right, tell me, you talk to them, right, it's sort of a bit like a best man speech. You say, right, tell me background, tell me about this person, tell me about these people, what
Mm,
makes them tick, tell me some stories, and then I'll wind that into a routine or a poem or something like that.
yeah.
And then I'll wrap that around what I do normally, what is my sort of current affairs stuff. So it might be Boris, it might be stuff about Rishi Sunak, it might be what's going on. So you get a mixture of what's topical and what I'm known for and the voices, but also what's something that's sort of personalized. And what's fulfilling about that is just knowing that at the end that they know that you've kind of made it special for them, and
Yes.
you've
Yeah.
sort of done the homework. And I'm also, sometimes in the old days, you'd be booked for doing an after dinner, and literally you wouldn't have dinner with them. You would sort of come in, you get a knock on your hotel bedroom door, and they
Yeah.
say, right, you're on in 10 minutes. You sort of walk down,
Oh,
um, go and do the show, and that's fine. But now I much prefer, spend the evening and you talk with the people, you eat with them at the table, and unless you're a surprise, of course,
yes.
but you find out a little bit about the audience, and that's
Yeah.
kind of where I am now. And I'm not
Mm,
doing I'm doing kind of a radio. We're doing I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue, which I love, which is such an institutional radio for, and that's a joy, working with people like Jack D and Miles Jupp and Pippa Evans. And so it's so, and Tony Hawk's, I don't know if you listen to Radio 4's I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue. That's quite a niche impression. It sounds a little bit like Ken Campbell as well, actually, come to think of it. But so that's the kind of, in terms of broadcasting, that's what I love doing, and not doing a TV thing at the moment. I mean, I don't think, apart from Have I Got News for You, there's not a kind of that satire show of the kind of thing that I did with John Byrne and John Fortune, and I don't think the TV companies don't really have the budget for them, and I don't think they have the appetite really, because
no.
they would need to be able to take on governments. And the trouble is, if you take on a government now, people sort of say, oh, you're just you're Labour lovies and lefties, and you think you don't have to be lefty or Labour or anything like that to just find that the way that the government's behaved in the last few years indeed is appalling. But it's defended this, it's whatever. Oh, were you making the same jokes about Corbyn? Oh, were you doing the same jokes about, well, just let's deal with what's in front of us. And if you're defending what's in front of you now, then your perceptions have so changed from what you might have accepted in a government 10 years ago.
No, absolutely. So sorry, going back to Sorry I Haven't a Clue. You've got a tour, haven't you?
Yeah, we're off.
That's going on. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yep. Well, you have to look on the website to see where it's going. But I mean, I know it's going to be Cheltenham, Brighton, Worthing, Eastbourne. Cheltenham, I think, is 2nd of December. Yeah, that's classic Gloucester home counties sort of stuff. And so then on I think it's the 5th or 6th, Brighton, Worthing, Eastbourne. There's a certain demographic comes to mind, isn't there? But then next year we're off, and it's Huddersfield, and it's Halifax, and it's places, and we're actually in Manchester and Bradford at the end of this month. So it's just it's a joy to be on tour with that show, because it's live shows. It's not sort of recording ones, and it's kind of greatest hits. But the joy, and we're able to play big theatres because it's such a popular show that you're in theatres which are 1,500 seat, 1,800 seat theatres, and to hear the laughter. I started doing that tour with Tim Brooke Taylor, and he was just so loved, and he would be doing, people knew him from the Goodies or whatever. And it comes back to what I was saying earlier about the joy and the fun, and people come together and they know that for those 2 hours they're just it's not going to be heavily political. If at all, it's just silly. It's that release of laughter. And I've talked about two things. I've talked about that joy and that coming together, and I've also talked about the state of politics at the moment. But I suppose Have I Got News for You? I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue is where you can. It's just for fun. And they say the political stuff is, you keep it for the news quiz or programs like that. But I mean, I think it is really necessary to ask the questions now. But I mean, I don't. You just have to look at what's been going on the last few weeks and months and say, is that normal, and is that rational? And I'm sure the answer to both of those is no.
Yeah. And do you find the pressure of performing live? Do you sort of feel the pressure a bit more than if it's a script?
Well, both really, because obviously if there's a TV thing, you want to get it right. And I used to do it at the beginning of this because I'd write it last minute. When we did Bird and Fortune, I mean, I literally had to write the show in 2 days with Jeff, my producer. Wow. So we'd write it on a Monday or a Tuesday, and we'd go off on location and film on Wednesday. So that would be the sketches with maybe Tony Blair in those days, or George Bush. So you'd get a house somewhere on the M25, a big sort of stately home that gave you one room which could be Blair's office, a staircase which could be Buckingham Palace, a large hallway or reception room that could be the White House, all of those. And so you'd film your sketches on the Wednesday. Thursday you'd be in the studio, maybe being interviewed by Jon Snow or Kirsty Young or somebody in character, and doing those blue screen things, when they have a weather map and you've got to have a studio things for that. And then on the Friday you'd come in front of a studio audience, and that was like a live show, but I'd finish writing that in the makeup chair. I mean, I'd write it all Friday together with my lovely friend John Langdon, who sadly died a couple of years ago, the guy I wrote with. Yeah. And we would write all Friday, and John Byrne and John Fortune would drop in and make some contributions. And we'd sort of make each other laugh really for the day. And then I'd have to go in front of the audience, and I do it once, maybe at sort of 6 o'clock, and then realize, oh, that bit needs to get cut, that needs to be cut. So the script would change massively between 6 o'clock and then 7:30 when he went in front of the audience. And I'd often go out and I'd be doing the warm up. I'd look at the auto cue, and John had taken all the corrections we'd made, and literally I'd be watching the corrections being made on the auto cue.
Oh God.
And I'd be warming up the audience, and I would just use then I'd have to just sight read it for the first time in front of them. And so that I developed that thing of, you would just do the because you didn't want to tell the audience the jokes, so I would be reading them, but in a way that they couldn't hear. So let's say if I was doing Bill Clinton followed by Nelson Mandela, Bill Clinton followed by Nelson Mandela, followed by David Attenborough, I'd read it and I'd go, and it was a shorthand, and I'd be sort of and then you'd do the thing. But you'd get into that and you'd record it. But I realized if you just read the auto cue off, the audience is just kind of almost taking it for granted. So I would sometimes deliberately make a mistake sort of very early on. So the audience would go, oh, hang on, we've got to get on side, because if we're not, as an audience, if we don't kind of support this performance, and so you get more energy out of the audience that way. And then I realized that the team were taking bets up in the gallery in the studio. The team were taking bets on how many words into the routine I would or how many sort of seconds I'd get into the routine before I deliberately made a mistake, because that would then I'd have to start again, and the audience would realize they would just think, oh, they would be involved. They think, oh, come on, this is
good.
we're making. So there's that's TV. But for live shows, I just put more work into each show now than I used to. I'd always like to get somewhere. If I'm doing a show sort of 7 or 8 o'clock, I like to get somewhere about sort of 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. Just sit down, think, right, what's going on at the moment? What's happening in the news? What are the characters? What's today's story? Who's this audience? How can I make it work for this audience? And that's it's a bit like, as Andy Zaltzman called his things, it's like a satirist for hire, which is kind of it's almost a contradiction in terms, but it's doing what I do, but for more specific audiences.
Brilliant. So good. Well, moving on to other things, you're a patron of ADHD Foundation. Can you tell us a bit about why this is close to your heart?
Okay, well, in common with a lot of comedians, in fact, according to my agent, most of them, I do have an element of ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or supposed to be. I mean, I query 2 of those words, deficit, because it's hardly like I'm not paying attention. It's not attention deficit. It's I'm paying attention to far too many things going on, but just not the thing I'm supposed to be concentrating on. So it's a very, very active, hyperactive mind, of course. So that's what you've got. And the disorder thing, well, it's a condition more than a disorder, and it's manageable. It is manageable, but it affects sort of 1 in 20 in the population. So that's what, about 5%. Absolutely, it's a lot. But increasingly the awareness is, as we're talking more about mental health, is that so many of us are on the spectrum, but so many of us have these things. I mean, there are people, you yourself, and many people listening will have days when they're they're not paying attention, or when they're forgetful, or they do
frequently
things. I suppose it's the thing. I suppose it's the thing of when that becomes a real impairment, when it really does, it dominates your life. It makes it difficult to hold down relationships or hold down jobs or whatever, because you're not able to focus, because you are too restless, in the case of ADHD. But what you need to remember, of course, is there is kind of a term I use sometimes, which is about either restless creativity or creative restlessness. And what you have to think about is, now people who are ADHD, we're talking about that spectrum, which takes in dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD, mild Asperger's, even mild autism, which all comes under the umbrella term neurodiversity. And you'll find now that increasingly, firstly, the science is catching up. I'll come back to that. But secondly, that companies particularly tech companies, are hiring people who are neurodiverse, because they bring things which are different. They want people who are thinking out of the box. And when you think that, I said 5% of the population roughly is thought of as being of having ADHD, but 30% of entrepreneurs So 1 in 3 entrepreneurs are neurodiverse or on the spectrum. We just have to look at somebody like Elon Musk, for example.
Yes.
I mean, that is the most successful, and in history, people like Mozart and Da Vinci and Einstein. They
it's almost like
are
a superpower, isn't it?
Well, it is. People do think of it as a superpower. I mean, in terms, but it also can be very debilitating if you're a child and you're taught, because we have that sort of sedentary sit down and copy and listen to what the teacher's saying sort of paradigm for education, and that's not a paradigm that fits people with very, very hyperactive brains, and so they're seen as being sort of disruptive in the classroom. And so the tragedy is that so many of our younger children who are in school and who are neurodiverse find themselves being excluded because the school doesn't know how to manage them. And I think it was Francis Ford Coppola said that the things that they exclude you for as a child are the things they give you lifetime achievement awards for when you're older, because so much of it is this almost unstoppable, uncontrollable creativity. I said the science is catching up, because it used to be thought of, ADHD used to be thought of as a sort of moral problem or a behavioral problem. It was, this or naughty children or bad parents. And there are naughty children and there are bad parents, but this is of a different order entirely. And you recognize that you will know if you have a neurodiverse or ADHD child in the family, and people will recognize it in a class. And you've got to find ways now. It's incredibly difficult to get diagnosis, and a lot of people they go private and get a diagnosis privately, but then they can't get back into the health service because people will say, well, if you've gone private, you've crossed that bridge, and we're not going to pick up from what the private sector's done. I mean, I hear tales of people having to wait 6 or 7 years for diagnosis.
For goodness sake, that's so bad, isn't it?
We really have. And when you think that, something like 25% of the young offenders population and 25% of the prison population are people who are recognizably ADHD, you think how transformative it would be if we were able to diagnose early and to pick this up early and see it in terms of the superpower and see it in terms of something that needs to be managed. And also it would save a fortune. The cost over a lifetime of an individual to society with ADHD is £1.2 million over the course. That's in terms of interventions, in terms of social, 1.2 million. But the cost of treating somebody with ADHD between the ages of 6 and 16 is 9,000.
Wow.
So
what a statistic.
So 9,000 for diagnosing, 9,000 for diagnosing, or 1.2 million over the course of a lifetime and that's because people will, if it's undiagnosed, if it's untreated, people will self-medicate. They get involved with drugs or drink or whatever, or they will, have lives which are complicated. So diagnosis? It's still not a specific diagnosis now. It's quite subjective. You have an interview, and that process itself is quite painful, because for me as a performer, I concentrate all the time on projecting success and confidence. And in a way, if you're judging yourself on your inability or your disorder, you spend the day sitting. It can be very harrowing, upsetting experience. But what I say to people is, if you're going for a diagnosis of ADHD, for example, you kind of know that you've got it anyway, and just look at it. It's just confirming something you already knew. Treatment now. Okay, medication does come into it, as and people sort of say, oh, it's there's over prescription stuff. It's not. There's not over prescription. It's a very, very the medication is very, very peer reviewed. I think it's just about the most peer reviewed and the most reviewed type of medication. And I've known sort of adults that take it that it's changed their lives. It's wives who say they've got their husband back because they've now got somebody in the family who is able to put the restless puppy to one side and to concentrate or to focus. And it's not unlike sort of antidepressant drugs, which take a long time to go on and a long time to come off, all the rest of it. Methylphenidate, Ritalin, these, as my understanding is, they can be, it's like putting on a pair of glasses. It is that much clarity and that much ability to concentrate on one thing in particular. And so that's one thing, but also, I mean, I took Ritalin when I was doing a documentary, and it just slowed me down, funnily enough, because there's
Did you
something
not
about what I'm
like that?
doing.
Did you
No, I
not
did.
like that?
Well,
You felt like it curbed your...
somebody said, don't take it when you're doing shows, but you might want to take it when you're doing your tax return.
Oh God.
Because the very act of comedy is, you are, but I've got comedian friends who are medicated as well, but they have, there's something about, you want your brain to be going off in different directions,
Of
because
course,
that's
yeah.
part of the virtuosity, really. So but that's just one thing. There are so many coping strategies as well. I'm a sort of frantic list maker, because there's so many things I need to try and remember, and so I don't drop the ball.
Yeah.
Routine, in terms of children, if they're always forgetting their soccer boots or something, if they're always forgetting their sports kit on a Wednesday, you tie a label onto their school bag with a picture of a football boot or something like that.
Yes.
Or if I'm worried about leaving my phone somewhere or my passport somewhere, I put my passport into the bag that I carry, my sort of briefcase that I carry around all the time, because I know it'll be harder for me to lose the briefcase than it is to lose the
Lose a
passport.
passport. Yeah.
And these just little ways where, you just have little, and there's all sorts of apps and stuff to help you
Yes.
concentrate, and you can switch off your phone and stop it from, constantly interrupting. But if you imagine being in an open plan office, and your phone is buzzing away, you're on your computer screen, people are sending you messages on Instagram, there's maybe one or two TV screens on, there's people on calls around you, there's a fire engine going past. You're not going to produce your best work necessarily at that time, but that's what it can be like within an ADHD brain. And the thing is about sort of learning and finding techniques where you can close things down. But unfortunately, we're in a society which is incredibly hyperactive. The pulls on your attention now, it's all about being distracted, isn't it? If you think about it, if you just sit down at your computer, say, right, I'm going to write this letter, then ping, you get emails coming in from somebody you shopped with last week, who's saying the latest offer, or you parked your car at an airport car park, and you're getting their latest deal in. You're getting, I mean, I would say I get probably 15, 20 emails or 15 emails a day from different companies or website or whatever, even your mobile phone provider or your bank or whatever.
And text message. I mean,
each of the texts. So we're a society, we're a very restless society. And again, just as the anger is monetized, so our attention is monetized, in the sense that they are, you give your email address in order to be able to buy a shirt online.
Oh, it's a nightmare.
And that then gives them the right to distract your attention for the next few, until you unsubscribe.
Yeah.
But there are ways of doing that. So what am I saying? I'm saying that, that the most important thing is that people with ADHD, once they recognize it, is that they don't beat themselves up, because it makes you who you are. For better or worse. And yes, there are superpowers. You will be able to concentrate intently on something that grabs your attention. You really will. You do have an ability to concentrate. And hyper focus, they call it. But that's not to take away from the fact that there'll be times when you feel wretched because you've forgotten something again, or you've let yourself down again, or you've been impulsive or whatever. But you are who you are, and I think you need to learn to laugh at the downside, and learn to kind of recognize and think, well, it's just not. I've got you. I know. And once you understand that, that if you've got your diagnosis, you've diagnosed yourself, you think, well, I know why I'm behaving like that, and next time I'm going to be a little bit more on the lookout for it. It's like, you've got a particularly restless dog puppy, but you know how to deal with it.
Yes, exactly.
So, but I'm just really, what I want to do is to try and spread that message, so that young people, and particularly all parents who have that in their family, or even people who are struggling day in, day out to keep their life on track, so that they know that there is hope, and they know that they're not alone, and they know that actually what seems to be a debilitating disorder or weakness can in fact be a strength. And the great thing is to find a lifestyle or a vocation or a job, if it's possible, where that is an asset and not a liability. So maybe, unfortunately, things like accountancy and law may be the more difficult areas in which to concentrate.
Yes.
Although having said that, there's some incredibly creative and incredibly diverse, neurodiverse lawyers. But we're in this links back to what we were saying earlier. We're in a very this is where disruption is a big part of our world now. You look at disruptive technologies like Uber and Netflix. Now, a few years ago, you had the taxi model. Now Uber's blown that out of the water. Similarly, Netflix. Do you remember when we used to get those VHSs from Blockbusters and stuff? Well, Netflix has taken over. So we've disrupted technology, but also we've got disrupted politics. We've got this sense in which people feel they need to completely turn the order upside down. And maybe what happened in the last few weeks was this extraordinary sort of experiment that went on, that people who'd been pawing the ground for the last 20 years to get their hands on power and say, right, we're coming out of this and we're not doing that, and we're going to reject the orthodoxy. And they tried to do it in one afternoon. And it's just rather like, so you're going to swim the channel. And then one day somebody's taking you to the coast and there's a raging gale.
Yes.
And there's a force 9 gale saying, no, I've said I'm going to swim the channel and I'm going to do it today.
Do it
regardless.
Anyway.
You think that, well, that's just stupid, isn't it? I mean, that's just plain ridiculous. So it's a crazy, it's a crazy world, but you've got to kind of find ways of, in terms of satire, and people are less, also maybe they're more, I find when I'm doing stuff on Twitter now, people will absolutely object to your comedy because their politics are different. And people used to say to me during the Scottish referendum, they said, don't insult me, I voted for Alex Salmond, or I voted for so-and-so, and I'm not insulting you, I'm making comedy, I'm making comedy from a point of view, and if you disagree with it, there may be other jokes that you like, and I'm not insulting you, I'm exercising my comic freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, gosh, you must find, do you get asked everywhere you go, drinks parties, dinner parties, you just get asked to do impersonations the whole time? Do you get sick of it?
No, much less so now, actually. I mean, I think, you can turn it on and turn it up and turn it down. And if there are times when you're aware that you're singing for your supper and you kind of need to turn it up a little bit. And
must be quite draining.
I did say that to Tessa the other day. So look, I know, but I'm I think they want me to sing for my supper a little bit. And so I'll just put up with that, because also, I have a tremendously lucky life. I do, I get to go to amazing places and meet extraordinary people and all the rest of it. And sometimes, the price of that is that I might, need just to entertain them. So, but I'm, I don't know what else I could have done in my life. I mean, I've been incredibly lucky. I'm very old now, but I've been able to kind of make that living out of making people laugh by sort of extending or kind of developing developing how I look at the world on a great scale, on a macro scale, in terms of what's going on politically, or on a micro scale of what's happening in that particular environment. So that's a perfect career for somebody who has an attention span of about 1.3 seconds, but whose brain darts around, and you've got that pinball brain. There's also, obviously, I like instant gratification, and you want to be liked, and also that could be a snack. Like everything in life is a strength and a weakness.
Of course. Well, you're utterly brilliant at it. And one quick question: have you got any plans to write an autobiography?
Yeah, I just haven't decided whose. Yeah, I don't know who's but I mean, I suppose it comes to me sometimes. I think, well, it'd be quite nice to do an autobiography where it's not necessarily chronological. It's just you take, how sometimes reminiscence, it comes just you remember a particular moment, and if you sat down over the course of a year, you thought, oh yes, I remember there was that afternoon, and then you wrote about that particular
just noting down all the things that come in.
I mean, I really enjoy writing, and I miss sort of I used to do the odd column or the odd diary, and I miss doing that. But then sort of other things sort of crowd in. I mean, as you get older, family and children and stuff like that. And I've got one daughter who is sort of going through uni at the moment, and as anyone who's got children at university, you need to kind of help them straighten up and fly right. And I've got another daughter who's madly into, she does show jumping, and she's doing this at European level. So she's currently sort of in Portugal, and part of you are thinking, God, you know, how can you afford to keep this horse at this level and all the rest of it?
Cheap, is it?
Which is a very first world problem. And the other half, and the most important half, is because you're saying, you know, just let her be safe. And you know, I think there was one video I took a while ago of her riding, and she was going to show it to a friend. She said, I can't use it. I can't use this video. I said, why is that? She said, because all I can hear is you going, be safe, be safe, be safe. And I was filming her, and at the same time I was going, oh, be safe. But I know that she's doing what she loves. So so that's
it's hard to watch.
But families are busy, and life is busy, and life is complicated. But I'm very, very lucky in that I'm able to kind of do what I enjoy. But it absolutely, the fulfillment comes from on a particular. So I know somebody on your website might decide they have their wedding anniversary coming up, and I kind of enjoy that, because I enjoy meeting the people, and you can just make an evening special.
Really special.
In the absence of the other stuff, which I love translating operas. I do that. I haven't done one of those for a little while, but I loved that. I loved when I did Carmen. Did it many years ago. Then it was revived. Jonathan Miller did a version of it about 6 or 7 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. And just sitting into a few rehearsals and seeing that take shape. So in the absence of doing the translations, or in the absence of doing a sort of full-blooded satire show on radio or television, I just concentrate on doing live shows in particular circumstances, and you know, doing that as the best as I possibly can.
Oh, Rory, thank you. Thank you so much. Could you just finish off doing your favorite impression?
Well, you know, Trump is such a big one, Panda, such a big one. And I know Grapevine, and we started it together. I remember you came to me, you said, Donald, I need an idea. And I said, Grapevine, do Grapevine. It's a wonderful idea. I love the name. I got it from a great friend of mine, Marvin Gaye. You remember Marvin Gaye, and he and I were tremendous friends. We played a lot of golf together. And so, because I had a lot of great friends in those days. One, Gandhi, there was another one. I played a lot of golf with Gandhi, and he was a very thin gentleman. He used to hold the flag. I didn't know which was the flag and which was Gandhi. So he's very, very popular. And of course, Boris is another. But we haven't done Jacob Rees-Mogg. I might say I recognize some of my furniture behind you, Panda, the rather delightful antique chair. He's a character out of Gilbert and Sullivan, and I may finish with the song. Here's a little song about all the countries I can't stand. There's Portugal and Italy and Poland and Romania, the Netherlands, Germany and France, Lithuania, Sweden, Spain and Hungary and Finland and Estonia, Slovenia, Slovakia, and maybe Macedonia. There's Malta, Belgium, Greece, the Czech Republic, and Croatia, and Luxembourg and Cyprus, which is practically in Asia, and Austria and Latvia and Denmark and Bulgaria, and Ireland, and if Turkey joins, the whole thing gets much scarier. But now we're out of Europe, we'll no longer be inferior. We're even doing trade deals with Burundi and Liberia. They tried to stop us leaving, which was perfectly absurd of them. It's what the British public voted for, at least a third of them. Thank you very much. That's why I'm no longer in the cabinet.
Very, very good. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
God, you're good. You're so good. Thank you very, very much, Rory, for sparing the time. We've been ages, and I
know. Well, you have to cut that down. For poor people, they would have an hour in their day to
no, they'll love it. They will love it, and I can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you very much. Actually,